Bene, buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti. Welcome to you all. I think we start sharp with, we have this tradition in Italy. We call it academic 15 minutes late. And as a professor, nobody's perfect. I think I'm bound to stick to the rules. So I hope you liked yesterday's evening. It was part of the proceedings because we think also having a nice evening together helps to reflect together and work together. And I must confess, even for a Roman, looking at that beauty, it's impressive. So I hope you liked it. So we are ready to start our second day. And I think it will be Fausto Felli, the chair of the Executive Board of Integrate, to introduce the session, and then we hand it over to the panel. So Fausto, if you can come to the floor for your introductory remarks.
Yes, thank you, Paolo. Thank you to everybody. And just a few words to remember that this morning we will travel around the puzzle of a social, made more complicated by the puzzle of infrastructure. It is not easy to understand the potentiality of this initiative, but I want only to underline that social infrastructure does really come from constitutional laws. Social infrastructure lets people to have the constitutional rights functioning in daily life. Without social infrastructure, people don't live in a good way. Said this, we are speaking of long-term investing in social infrastructure. We are speaking about a new thing, long-term investing, which is taking a shape. Just yesterday, commissioners and ministers explained that this field is the future. But as somebody said, it is necessary to understand that the social infrastructure represents really something very, very particular in the field of long-term investing, which is to say that the demand side is particularly important. The supply side must be viewed in another dimension, and the institutional side will represent really the difference between success and unsuccess of the initiative. Institutions can do a lot of things to facilitate social infrastructure. And this putting in a virtual negotiating table the representative of supply side, demand side, and institutional side. For this, I think that this morning we will open a new space in which you cannot use the same terminology as other fields in long-term investing. This is quite another thing. If we accept the idea to speak of another thing, we will start in a right way. For this, I thank you for your participation. I thank all the speakers, all people involved. And I am sure that we will be able to understand the specificity of this speech and to give good legs to this initiative with our works in this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for managing to move on from yesterday's excellent evening to wake up and appear here this morning. I mean, we were anticipating maybe 2 or 3 people might turn up, so this is quite a surprise to all of us. Thank you very much for that. This panel is about the demand side. And I'd like to start off by saying that financial markets, the real economy, and society are actually a ménage à trois. Each depends on the other two, and none of the three are inherently stable. And there is a need to learn to cope with messiness. And the solutions to messiness are not always pure rational solutions. And so we should think of other ways to work together. And the point that Fausto made about a particular attention is needed for the demand side is because if we look at the proverbial negotiating table between supply and demand, then the demand side, I think, is coming to that table in a weaker state than it should. And there's a need to improve the competency there, as well as improve their understanding of what they need to bring to the table. I think in the interplay of economy, society, and financial markets, social infrastructure provides a crucial catalyst for employment, money, and interest. And I hope that Keynes would agree with me about that. A friend, David, sitting next to me from Harvard, would say that the key for developing investable social infrastructure is the ability to know when private investment is the path to go down. And right now, we don't actually know enough to make such a judgment. And I hope that what some of my colleagues here are going to be talking about this morning will give a sense about where the supply side is coming from and how to play this particular game. The first speaker this morning is David Wood. He's Director of the Initiative for Responsible Investment at the University of Harvard, and he's going to focus on the need to develop a robust system for delivering investable projects and programs that meet a growing investor need for investments that target superior social outcomes. David.
But I've been told to stand, and it's good for me to have a defense, to clutch onto here from the podium. I want to apologize to the translators, those of you who are listening in translation. I have a Catalan friend. 5 years after I first met her, she said, I haven't understood a word you've said for 5 years. You talk too fast. I'm going to try not to talk so fast. I found yesterday totally fascinating. Just a couple things I feel as an emissary from the US. Somebody said yesterday, well, in the United States, maybe they've figured out PPPs, but here we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to make them really work. In the United States, we can't even say PPP. The term has become so poisoned by debates over their effectiveness that everybody in government and in private investment, they say, we need a new term. We need to just figure out something different to call it. And then maybe that'll open up space to make this public-private interaction more effective. That was one thing I thought I'd bring up from yesterday. The second, it was interesting to hear how robust our economic recovery has been yesterday. Speaker after speaker said, well, we didn't have that wonderful stimulus plan. It doesn't feel all that robust when you're in the US. I think we're all facing this same problem of, secular stagnation, whatever you want to call it. And I think one of the things we're wrestling with as we think about social infrastructure is this fundamental, problem in the macroeconomy. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's out there. That's my time over there. Okay, 8 minutes. So the IRI, my research project is called the Initiative for Responsible Investment. It's at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm actually part of the Hauser Institute for Civil Society, which is part of Harvard Kennedy School, which is part of Harvard, and we're down in the basement. These are orders of priority. What we study is the social utility of finance. We work with investors, it's applied research, and we work with investors who are either using the tools of finance to target social outcomes, positive social outcomes, or investors who are incorporating environmental and social information into their decisions for long-term sustainable returns. Some might call the first impact investment, some might call the second responsible investment. And interestingly enough, in infrastructure, there's been a convergence. So I work with labor-affiliated pension fund trustees, the kind of people who are in Raffaele's long-term investors club, and we'll hear a little bit more about the role of labor in this. They see long-term investment as a way, in part, to smuggle in the social imperatives of finance, to see over the long term how we can achieve social goals with market tools. And the words long-term have an ethical weight as well as just a sense of investment time horizons being readjusted. On the other hand, I work a lot with foundation endowments, mid-size, not all that big, between 100 million and 2 to 3 billion, some are a little bit larger, who are really looking for channels in finance where they can use concessionary money, they can use guarantees, they can use other tools to crowd in private investment that has a particular social purpose. And then finally, I have a project on public policy and impact investing, which looks globally at the different kinds of policies, like the Juncker Plan, that are meant to catalyze private investment towards public good. Over the past couple of years, the asset class of infrastructure has dominated discussions in all of these different fields and with all of these different kinds of investors, because infrastructure is seen, one, to respond to the longer-term time horizons of large institutional investors who feel underserved right now in the market, and two, because of its public goods imperative. But there are no deals, as Thierry Dow said. Now, all these investors, the foundations, they don't find the deals they're looking for. The larger institutional investors who've committed to infrastructure, they don't find the deals they're looking for. And so the problem that I think we're all working on is what is a good deal that creates social benefit, that offers reasonable rates of return, and that fits into the needs of these different kinds of investors. So that's what we've been working on for the last couple years. We've spent a lot of time, in particular, with large metropolitan areas in the United States. And I'll mention four. Detroit, as hard a place to work and invest in as you can imagine. San Francisco, the hottest real estate market in the US, except maybe mine in Boston. Denver, which is rapidly undergoing a social and physical transformation. And Los Angeles, which is, if you haven't been to Los Angeles, it looks like a Chinese city right now. The cranes are everywhere, and the city's been totally transformed over the last few years. What we've been working on, typically with the advocacy community, but also with the investment community, is identifying where there are projects, investable deals, that with the right kind of project preparation can be brought to market, but also deliver on their social goals. And I think this is where I intersect with Fausto's description of what social infrastructure is. We're trying to do something different. This implies a different way of investing, but it also implies different skills in bringing projects online. And I just want to make 3 quick points that I think about which we've learned over the past few years. In the first place, there was a lot of talk yesterday, I thought very helpful talk about how infrastructure investment should serve public priorities. That's what explains the subsidy in something like the Juncker Plan. That's what explains all the efforts that go into project preparation. And what we've found is that there are wonderful long-term plans in these metropolitan communities, ways to organize public priorities. What we don't have are ways to coordinate those priorities with investment opportunities. So we've had cities like Detroit go through intense planning processes for sustainable communities and identify the social infrastructure they need. They haven't quite created a business plan that then takes the sort of large-scale sustainable plan and builds out a set of investable opportunities. And Detroit's also, I think, one of the better examples of a place that's almost getting there. They've concentrated resources so that the foundation community, the public sector, and now beginning with the institutional investment community, have been willing to choose deals along one central corridor and start the rebirth of Detroit in one place. And that concentration of resources, I think, is the first step towards creating a set of deals that match these public priorities. The second point, we heard a lot yesterday about the lack of projects and the need for projects. We have found that one key step that these communities can take is mapping potential deals that exist in the marketplace, and then beginning to identify what different kinds of capital that can be brought to bear on these investment opportunities. In the US, social infrastructure deals we call them brain damage deals. They're idiosyncratic, they require intense amounts of effort. Typically, there's one kind of champion who has to push them through over long periods of time. What I presume is that mapping the set of deals and designing things like the ELTIF fund that was talked about yesterday is a way to reduce transaction costs across the individual deals. And we've made a little bit of progress, but not a lot. And I think that's very much on the table. The place that's probably been most successful on this aspect is San Francisco, where because of the crazy retail real estate market, the housing prices are just through the roof, the city is willing to bring land. Subsidy is being concentrated around this land, and institutional investors can find a role in creating affordable housing that's meant to just preserve the community from becoming a playground for people who can afford to be there. Last point I'll make, and this goes back to Jonathan's introduction, the investors I work with are not really satisfied with the broad social story around infrastructure investment. They're not sure how to know when private investment is the right tool to solve a social problem, or when they're being overburdened with social goals in order to make deals happen. Again, the most active discussion right now in the U.S. is around physical infrastructure, and the pension fund community in particular is really interested. And in fact, the big news in this field is that CalPERS, the large state pension fund in California, divested from its hedge funds because they felt that they're too big and the hedge funds weren't serving them. And they said, we're going to put this money to infrastructure. And they have a lot of social goals attached to those kinds of investments in the built environment. But they're not sure how to engage in infrastructure investment that uses unconventional channels of capital formation and has social goals. The trustees want something out of the investments, the asset managers have different needs, and the rates of return expectations are misaligned. We have a number of projects in the US that are underway to try to build in social value to infrastructure investments, to try to prioritize those investments with high social value to justify public subsidy. But we still haven't managed to make that connection between the money that's on the table from the public sector, the money that's at rest in the private sector, and what the foundation community is coming to call high road infrastructure investments. And I think it's the work of projects like these, the work of Jonathan and the work of Fausto in particular I'm thinking of, to define what a high road investment is and to identify where the social purpose resides in these kinds of investments that is necessary in order to make that coordination between public and private sector work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Our second speaker on my left is Miklos Solska, who is the former Minister of State for Health in Hungary. In fact, he stayed in the job for 4 years, which in Hungary is very impressive to achieve, and that's because he was a very excellent Minister for Health. And he's going to show why investing in responsible and sustainable health infrastructure can no longer follow traditional care models, in particular about the need for a threshold of intelligent data flow and analysis that can inform project appraisal.
I consider myself a public reformer, but I was all along the 4 years I was thinking about the reforms from an investment perspective. Where should we invest for efficiency or sustainability of the healthcare system? Where should we disinvest not to waste money? And where should we invest to gain more healthy life years? So your logic in a public sense is not alien to me, but I'm a public sector person. And you know, just the To understand where should we invest, I think you should know the health policy cycle in Hungary. The new administration comes into office, they have ideas, and then they intervene into the system. They have to do fast because the previous one had not enough time, they couldn't do anything, they couldn't solve problems, so they have to do it fast. There's a change in administration, and there's a vacuum and disturbance left behind. There comes a new administration, 180 degrees different ideas, they intervene into the system fast. Change in administration, vacuum disturbance. I'm sure that this is a similar life experience for you in public policies in many European countries. In Hungary, that led to an average life expectancy of a person in my chair for 20 months. Imagine the health reform you can do in 20 months. I was there for 48, so I managed to do a lot of things. And one of the reasons I could stay there for that long was that I did it with consultation. Before we intervened into the system, I toured the country 3 times. First round, I talked each and every mayor with the hospital, each and every county council, each and every hospital community problems. We have to move. Second, we agreed on the directions. And the third one, we agreed on what their role in the Hungarian healthcare system will be. And there we used evidence, and I will show you some of it. And we did radical things. In public health, I introduced the public health tax. Imagine we taxed Coca-Cola and chips. So if you live an unhealthy life, sugar, salt, whatever, then you pay a little bit more for your risks. And from that money, I raised the salaries of nurses and doctors to keep them in Hungary because migration is a huge issue there. We also introduced an NHS. We took over all the hospitals into state hands from the municipalities because capacities were mushrooming. Prestige hospitals on 2 sides of a river were built because there was no central capacity control. So we took over all the hospitals, and I saw all the 48 contracts the hospitals made, and I saw all the 2 million bank transfers they made. Imagine the power of that stuff. Anyway, so we did a lot of stuff, even this is not a custom that a Hungarian public policy is praised in international use. The public health tax was praised even in Boston Globe. So this is just for fun. And now we just zoom into the maps. You know, before intervening into the healthcare system, we did some capacity mapping. Where did patients go? Where do they seek care? And we just looked at where do they receive care. We even modeled access times, where to put various services. And then we just regionalized the care. And then the interregional migration disappeared. So people could find care in their communities. We also looked on patient flows. We analyzed the patient, we network analyzed the patient flows among hospitals. What you see here is the Hungarian cancer care network. You see white patches in the southeast side of the care network, and we also looked into, for example, in the Budapest cancer care model, why that many patients move between the various dots. Is it the lack of therapy? Is it the lack of capacity? Is it the lack of knowledge? Because there is good migration and bad migration. For example, this migration is good because this institution has the radiotherapy, but it's so damn expensive that you do not want two radiotherapy centers on 2 sides of the river. So this is good. So we just institutionalize their relationship. And there are other movements where people are seeking for hospice. And hospice should be in the community. So you better invest in good hospice and not let people flowing around in an incurable disease, and that has to be in the communities. So these kind of charts were the basis of where to invest and where to disinvest. And just putting these crazy movements right. In 1.5 years, we increased the liver metastasis operations by 50%. Before that, those people did not get the relevant therapies. We said, no, you do not operate liver metastasis that many places in a city or in the country. You operate it in 8 in the country. And in 1.5 years, setting these complex patient pathways right, we increased the liver metastasis operations by 100%. So we found the missing 50%. So you know it is, and you know these patients are very costly. One therapy is tens of thousands, sometimes $100,000. So you do not want them to hobble around and have those expensive therapies in a small city hospital. But you have it in centers. And these kind of illnesses do not happen with you all around the year. This happens 1 or 2 times in your life. So we used innovative evidence to change the setting. Now let's, and you know, migration of labor force is a huge issue. So you better think out something to use them efficiently. E-health is another area where there is no ecosystem going around. So just an example, in Hungary, all the ambulance cars are equipped with tele-ECG machines. And in a cardiac center, they evaluate it, and then they rush with the patients into cardiac centers. But there is no financing, there is no payment system, there is no resource generation for that ecosystem to happen. But we have scarcity in cardiologists. And on a European level, 1 million people will missing from the health labor force by 2020. Again, so you invest in technologies and invest in efficient patient pathways if you want to set it right. And you know, you can trace the flights, you can trace your jogging habits, so you could trace your health status, you could send health warnings, public health warning, you could assist lifestyle. The sensors are there in your mobile devices, and you know how to use it, or the grandchildren of sick old people know how to use that technology. But you know, there is no ecosystem behind. I think one of the big investments should come into that e-health prevention, prediction, participation infrastructure. The mobile devices, one part of the ecosystem is there, and there's a culture to use it for other purposes. Now I'll show you some management control slides. This is the hospital indebtedness network analysis. The blue are hospitals, the yellow are various procurers. And this was done in the moment when the state took over the hospitals from the various municipalities. What you see here, the blue are the hospitals. The larger the blue is, the larger the debts of the hospital. The yellow are the various procurers. The larger the yellow is, the larger the money, the unpaid money to them. The larger the money they finance for hospitals. You see that 3 of them were financing the hospital indebtedness like banks. And yes, there was a banking operation behind it that is illegal in the Hungarian public sector. So I saved 50% on paying those procurers. I told them, fine, this is illegal. What if I pay 50%? And we were okay. And on this chart, because we recognized that there was a formation of monopoly markets, those who owed larger money to fewer companies, there was a monopoly market. But these hospitals were in the hands of 100 various municipalities, and still there was a monopoly there. So from the network analysis, we understood where should we intervene, and on this chart, understanding the market formation. For example, we introduced national joint procurement of energy. On gas alone, I saved 20%, and on electricity alone, I saved 15%. So new management control technology is in public sector will save your tax monies and liberate resources to invest somewhere else where there can be life years saved. So this is another very interesting area. And imagine, healthcare is an energy-intensive sector. If on a procurement system you can save 20%, what can you do with a targeted energy efficiency investment? And structural funds are so slow, and the magnitude of money in that is needed for energy efficiency in healthcare sector is just unimaginable. And I see that my time run out. Just 2 more, if I may. 3 more, quick. One is, we have to invest in citizen learning, because we have to explain them. You do not demand the prestige hospital, but you demand the efficient community setting. I closed up 14 hospitals. I finished the acute hospital care in 14 hospitals, and I gave them local community centers, outpatient services instead inpatient. But we have to help prime ministers, ministers of finance, and citizens to learn there is efficiency. The other is invest in preventive investments. The public expenditure on health will grow, and if you do not invest in efficiency now, there will be social sustainability problems 10, 15, 20 years from now. So that's a huge issue. So there has to be preventive investments in efficiency. Number 3 is that in pharmaceuticals, some of them are public utility products. So we should purchase innovation and not paying the marketing engine of big pharma. So these kind of stuff should happen in the coming years. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you, Miklos. Our third speaker asked me not to say what she's going to talk about or where she comes from. Well, she does come from Scotland, and she's going to explain it in a speech, but what I will say is that my part in her career was that I gave her her first job in Scotland, and since then she's gone on and achieved many things that nobody could conceive of at the time. Thank you for coming, Mary.
I was thinking last night when we had that beautiful tour of the museum and we looked out over the skyline of this spectacular city, and I thought, there is infrastructure. We looked at the Forum and the beautiful basalt roads and the archways and the statues, and we saw the functionality, the use of the hard stones for the roads that would be used most. The artistic purpose of the statues and the arches. But most of all, for me, you saw a statement of the values of Rome at that time. And for me, that is what social infrastructure in particular, but infrastructure in general, demonstrates to us. It tells us about what we prioritize, and it shows us what the values are in our society and what we value enough to pay for, and for whom. And so my angle here is very much from that direction, and not so much from the finance direction, which is not my area of expertise, but thankfully is many of yours. So when we talk about infrastructure, I am talking about values and priorities. I grew up in the west of Northern Ireland, and we had very poor roads, no trains, and at one point we were the unemployment black spot of Europe. Most of my uncles had to leave the country to work. And that was partly because we were more rural, we were further from the capital city, it was more expensive to get to us, but it was also because we were more Catholic and the political administration was Protestant, and at the time when the decisions were being made about where to invest, the decisions were made along those lines, and the legacy of that lasts for generations. And the legacy of the big infrastructure developments we're talking about lasts for centuries, for millennia in this city. So what I'm going to talk about is about demand, but it overlaps with supply in many respects, and about how social infrastructure and social impact are very closely linked. And again, that social outcomes are key indicators of the condition and the values of society. That demand is high for money, but the definitions of what appropriate money looks like varies. So some governments do not want to take money packaged in certain kinds of ways and with certain kinds of outcomes because they don't think that their citizens will accept it. That's very much the case in some parts of Scotland and very different from some parts of England. And that finance, the supply side, sees investment readiness as a very mixed bag at best, and that actually the project pipeline is very dry in lots of respects. This is my boss, this teddy bear. I come from the BBC and from a charitable foundation that has given over €900 million to charitable purposes. So children who go to school hungry cancer patients who don't get emotional support as part of the normal medical procedures that they're going through, and people in need, basically. And governments are increasingly looking to the big foundations to plug gaps in their available finances, and looking to us to step into that space, which is part of the reason why I'm here. The other reason is because I've just finished chairing a process that lasted all through this year, imagining the future for social services in Scotland, and coming up with scenarios for 2025. And one of the very interesting things from this process was that people did not talk so much about physical infrastructure, although that the hospitals and the schools and the kindergartens are absolutely important. They talked much more about what happens in those spaces, about how communities connect, about how people are supported by the society that they live in. In the UK, we have some very severe cuts going on now, trying to cut about more than 13 billion to achieve those savings. And that means cuts across lots of the areas that are key to social infrastructure. But there is a lot of investment planned as well, and there is a big look to the private finance world to try to find some of that money. In Scotland, the policy context is quite different. Some of you may have seen the independence referendum coverage. We have a stronger, I would argue, focus on social justice across the board. And there are big investment plans here too, but also not enough money. So there are ongoing discussions, and you'll hear from someone later who will talk to you about some of those discussions to find finance to do what we think is needed to do in society. Demand and supply can connect. A lot of the pension funds for local government in the UK are having these conversations now about, we get our money from these people who are working for the public sector to try to do good for society. Shouldn't we be considering using that money, investing that money in ways that support that core purpose? And could we be braver about the kinds of investment decisions and the basis on which we can justify those investment decisions? So, and especially around the concept of place. If you're a pension fund for a big area of England, what are you doing for that area and for the people from that area who are investing in your fund? These are just a couple of examples of things that are going on in England. A lot of focus on social housing at the moment, and again, I won't go into detail because you're going to hear some more information about an example in Scotland a little bit later in the session. But the basic message is that, in particular with the public sector pension funds, there is a lot of interest in trying to connect the demands of the clients, the demands of the public and the society for the kind of society they want to work in, with the investment decisions that are being made there. And of course you have to make all of your technical and risk-related decisions about investment, but there is certainly a ripe area for that discussion to happen more powerfully than it is doing at the moment. So for me, another key issue, and it was in the last presentation very clear as well, is we've talked a lot about the physical assets of infrastructure and social infrastructure, but they are worth nothing if what is happening in those spaces and around those assets is not making life better for people. So it's very important for me to think about the links between the assets and the infrastructure and the service delivery that happens in those spaces. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges on the finance side, because the service delivery aspects can be smaller in scale and therefore more difficult for you to imagine how it would work as an investment proposition. But it's really essential that we continue to have those conversations, because you cannot disconnect structure from systems and services. In the UK, some of you will know that we have done a lot to lead developments around social investment. We have an institution called Big Society Capital in London, which is quite controversial even in the UK, and I know there are very mixed views across Europe about whether the balance between the finance side and the demand on the social side is quite right. In Scotland, there is a lot of resistance to using certain kinds of private capital for social purpose. The idea of, it's an oversimplistic idea, but for some people they just feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea that anyone will make a profit from helping, from doing something that they feel is morally, you are morally obliged to do. So there's a really deep philosophical debate in Scotland in particular around that, because we still need the money, but we need it on terms that we can accept morally and philosophically. So that's the sort of picture of social investment across the UK at the moment, and pension funds are very active in there already, about £300 million to date. I've only got a couple more slides. There are a couple of developments happening in Scotland that are a little bit different, where government, the social sector, grants and foundations, grant makers and foundations, and in this case the banks, but they are talking as well with pension funds, are trying to get together to build funds that can be used to commission infrastructure and services in a very different kind of way, to get around some of the procurement constraints that affect government decision making. This is my last slide. To summarise, I think the summary on the demand and the supply side is very similar in relation to this sector. On the one side, on the finance side, there is a sense that some of the opportunities are too small; they can't work because of their scale. On the other side, on the demand side, they're complaining that the finance side want them to stretch beyond what's actually needed. So there's a kind of dilemma there. On the return side, sometimes finance saying it's not enough, we're not getting enough return here for this kind of investment, but the public and some of the policymakers feel that the returns are too high because of those moral reasons. So there's a kind of dilemma there as well. Equally, issues around risk, public perception. If government get into this private finance sphere more, there's risk that things will fall out badly and that they will suffer in vote terms as a result. But the main issue for me is why this conference has happened, that there is a need for more communication, for more liaison, for more hard work to figure out how some of these things can be done, even though at first they appear too difficult. Because ultimately the nature of the world we live in is at stake, and I don't want to be standing 10 years from now in my job still giving money to hungry children in the United Kingdom at this time. I don't want to be seeing so much need. I think we can do much more if we work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mary. That was quite inspiring and compelling. Our next speaker is Fausto Durante, who's head of the Europe Secretariat at the Confederation of Italian Trade Unions, who's going to explore the role of trade unions in long-term infrastructure investment, including a new initiative which they are launching in Italy. And he's going to speak in Italian to be on time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether my English is good enough for such a qualified audience, so I prefer to speak Italian to be more precise and efficient. Thank you. Grazie per aver coinvolto anche il sindacato, le organizzazioni dei lavoratori in questa discussione. La CGIL, che è il più grande sindacato italiano e che fa parte della Confederazione Europea dei Sindacati, ha lanciato già da 1 anno e mezzo la proposta di un nuovo piano del lavoro per il 2014, che ormai si sta concludendo, senza che purtroppo la proposta di questo piano sia stata mai discussa con le autorità politiche italiane, seguendo in questo lo stesso destino che è capitato alla proposta della Confederazione Europea dei Sindacati, che raggruppa 88 confederazioni sindacali nazionali, che ha sede a Bruxelles, di un piano straordinario di investimenti per la crescita e per l'occupazione giovanile in Europa, che ha l'ambizioso nome di New Path for Europe. Non abbiamo mai potuto discutere questa proposta con il Presidente Barroso. Speriamo che la nuova Commissione presieduta da Juncker trovi il tempo per affrontare il tema degli investimenti e della crescita con le organizzazioni dei lavoratori in Europa, e questo è, diciamo, il contributo che noi possiamo portare a questa discussione. Come potete immaginare, anche nel mondo del sindacato europeo è difficile trovare una unità di intenti e una comune posizione sul tema di quali investimenti per la crescita, quali settori privilegiare per rilanciare l'occupazione e lo sviluppo economico in Europa e soprattutto attraverso quali mezzi finanziare questo piano. Tuttavia noi, anche per via dell'asprezza della crisi economica che nel corso di questi anni ha pesantemente condizionato la vita e le condizioni di lavoro delle persone in Europa, siamo riusciti a mettere d'accordo differenti impostazioni politiche e culturali presenti nei sindacati in Europa e siamo riusciti a concordare su alcune linee guida che provo qui rapidamente a enucleare. Abbiamo bisogno di cambiare la politica economica dell'Europa di questi anni, perché quella politica economica, oltre a non risolvere i problemi strutturali, mettere il debito sotto controllo, assicurare la ripresa della crescita in Europa, invertire la tendenza alla crescita della disoccupazione giovanile, sta in qualche maniera impedendo alla stessa Europa di agganciare il treno della ripresa. Quindi bisogna passare dall'austerità, dal rigore, dalla disciplina un po' ossessiva, verso i bilanci sotto controllo, una politica che sia fatta in qualche modo di investimenti per la crescita. La proposta della Confederazione Europea dei Sindacati, che giunge alla fine di un percorso che ha visto, lo ricordavo prima, la CGIL proporre il piano del lavoro, il sindacato tedesco DGB proporre un impegnativo New Marshall Plan for Europe. Insomma, alla fine abbiamo riassunto queste proposte nel New Path for Europe della Confederazione Europea dei Sindacati, che chiede di investire per i prossimi 10 anni 2.500 miliardi di euro, 250 miliardi di euro all'anno per 10 anni, che come vedete come immaginate, sono una cifra molto superiore al timidissimo piano Juncker, che noi consideriamo largamente insufficiente. Dove investire questi 2.500 miliardi di euro? Ma noi pensiamo che ci sia un problema molto grave per l'industria europea oggi. Noi dobbiamo reindustrializzare l'Europa. L'Europa sta perdendo capacità competitiva nel suo insieme, anche in quei paesi che hanno costituito fino a questo momento la locomotiva e il traino. I nostri colleghi del sindacato tedesco sanno perfettamente che se non si inverte questa tendenza all'impoverimento della capacità tecnologica e dell'incorporazione nel processo produttivo di ricerca e di sviluppo, oltre che all'impoverimento dei salari, non ci sarà la possibilità per nessuno in Europa, tra quelli che vivono di lavoro dipendente, ossia la stragrande maggioranza dei cittadini in questo nostro continente, di comprare la loro manifattura. Quindi noi abbiamo bisogno di un grande progetto per la reindustrializzazione dell'Europa che ci consenta di recuperare capacità competitiva. Una reindustrializzazione che deve avvenire in senso socialmente ed ecologicamente sostenibile, che non è solo un problema del sud dell'Italia. Poi noi abbiamo un grande tema che è quello di ritornare a investire sull'ICT, sull'Information and Communication Technology. Io credo che siamo tutti quanti d'accordo fra di noi, al di là delle opinioni diverse che possiamo avere sulle scelte politiche, siamo tutti quanti d'accordo sul fatto che un continente come l'Europa, un sistema economico che sta cercando di integrarsi sempre di più come quello europeo, non può più permettersi, pena la incapacità di competere a livelli sufficienti, 28 sistemi nazionali di produzione, distribuzione e vendita dell'energia elettrica, 28 campioni nazionali nelle telecomunicazioni, 28 sistemi diversi per il trasporto, la logistica, la movimentazione delle merci e delle persone. Quello che sto provando a dire in sostanza è che noi dobbiamo procedere investendo denaro in questo senso nella interconnessione delle reti e delle capacità competitive dei sistemi e delle infrastrutture in Europa. E il terzo grande filone su cui noi pensiamo si debba investire è quello che riguarda le politiche legate all'invecchiamento attivo e che tengano conto del trend demografico. Nonostante tutti i nostri problemi, l'Europa è ancora il posto nel mondo in cui è più attraente nascere, vivere, lavorare. E quindi noi dobbiamo porci il tema di come a proposito di infrastrutturazione sociale e a proposito di investimenti votati alla socialità, noi affrontiamo il tema legato alla considerazione banale che si estende sempre più e tenderà ad aumentare il tempo di vita che una persona ha di fronte a sé una volta conclusa l'esperienza lavorativa, e che questo tema, che è legato appunto non solo al trend demografico ma alla necessità di politiche per l'invecchiamento attivo, non può essere risolto a livello europeo con modalità levantine, non può essere risolto con le badanti, come facciamo noi in Italia, chiamando persone che vengono da paesi meno ricchi rispetto al nostro a lavorare spesso in condizioni non dignitose e non sufficientemente trasparenti. Dobbiamo provare a riprodurre su scala europea esperimenti di welfare locale, di comunità che si stanno sviluppando in nazioni europee e anche extraeuropee, penso anche agli Stati Uniti, al Canada, penso che cosa sta cominciando a muoversi in questo senso in Australia, e dobbiamo essere perfettamente consapevoli che da questo investimento di tipo sociale non c'è solo un ritorno di welfare, c'è un ritorno economico, perché si tratta di creare nuovi posti di lavoro che assicurano reddito e ricchezza. Infine, i grandi due temi aggiuntivi dei quali abbiamo discusso di recente e sui quali la CGIL e il sindacato italiano hanno provato a interloquire col governo sono le altre due emergenze che noi vediamo fortemente presenti in Europa: la necessità di tornare a investire sulla scuola, sull'istruzione, sulla formazione, anche e soprattutto sulla formazione professionale e sull'incrocio fra domanda e offerta di lavoro. E l'altro grande tema veniva qui ricordato, a me non è stato possibile partecipare alla visita che è stata fatta ai monumenti di Roma, io ieri ero in Calabria dove ho partecipato a una delle tante iniziative che il sindacato italiano ha messo in campo nella giornata di sciopero generale e quindi non ho potuto visitare assieme a voi le bellezze di Roma che avete visto, ma il tema della infrastrutturazione culturale, della necessità di investire perché abbiamo il patrimonio storico, archeologico, artistico più bello del mondo, e qui in Italia siamo particolarmente contenti di poterlo ospitare. Ecco, è un tema rispetto al quale la necessità di investire più risorse, più denaro e più energia non può tradursi e non deve tradursi solo in una idea di spesa improduttiva, ma al contrario di spesa che produce ricchezza e benessere. Noi pensiamo che si possano trovare le risorse per fare questo piano, non devo fare un comizio per convincervi, ma insomma la nostra valutazione è che se è stato possibile in Europa, come era necessario e come noi abbiamo condiviso, trovare i soldi per salvare le banche, forse si possono trovare le risorse intervenendo sui grandi patrimoni, sulla evasione fiscale, sulla illecita costituzione di capitali all'estero, rivedendo fortemente le normative sui paradisi fiscali. Forse si possono trovare le risorse e bisogna mettere in comune dentro un grande fondo europeo per gli investimenti e l'occupazione le risorse che la Banca Europea degli Investimenti, i singoli Stati, gli investitori privati possono mettere in campo per provare a invertire la tendenza al declino e a far ripartire la locomotiva europea. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Fausto. Now, unfortunately, our final panel speaker, Sir Albert Bohr, who's the leader of Birmingham City Council and also on the Budget Committee at the Committee of the Regions, cannot make it because yesterday the flight control system in the southern part of England crashed. And he was one of those who was affected by that, so he can't make it. However, I have his speech here, and he asked me to give it on his behalf. So you have to imagine me as being a council leader from Birmingham now and not the chair of this panel, okay? What Sir Albert wanted to talk about was a regional reflection and conclusions, in particular in response to what was talked about yesterday in terms of the EU investment package, which has been announced by Jean-Claude Juncker. Indeed, he welcomes the package, but his concern is what impact will the EU's recently announced €21 billion investment have? He would say that the EU investment is not new or additional money. Indeed, 6 billion of it comes from the current Connecting Europe facility and the Horizon 2020 research program. He also asked the question if the estimated multiplier effect of 15 is to deliver 315 billion euros for strategic infrastructure projects over the next 3 years. Is that realistic? Jean-Claude Juncker himself said that it would be a pipe dream to think that the Commission alone can assure the total success of the investment package. And this was in reference to the engagement of national governments and the private sector. But he would argue that we should not forget the local level, particularly the role of cities in this. Let's look at the example of Birmingham. The question here is whether they have the right tools and power to act in this agenda. From the perspective of the local level, how will local and regional authorities be able to benefit from the EU investment package? How will the projects put forward by national governments connect with the local level and, crucially, with Europe's major cities, its main engines of growth? The opportunities and the need for investment in our cities are certainly there, and so he would have shared with you a few local initiatives, both physical and social, to illustrate how his city is taking forward the growth challenge. For example, in Birmingham last month, he unveiled the city's 20-year vision for improving transport across the city, effective and efficient transportation being one of the major catalysts for growth. And this includes a detailed program of short-term schemes. Birmingham is also focusing investment activity on 6 economic zones defined by both geography and economic sector. They include an advanced manufacturing zone, a city centre enterprise zone, an environmental enterprise district, a life sciences campus, a food hub, and the iTech park focusing on ICT. He's also been taking steps to tackle youth unemployment in Birmingham, which are, of course, examples of social investment. Cities such as Birmingham bring something else to the table, that they have strong and sophisticated relationships with their communities and with the third sector, and that should be tapped into to ensure that investment opportunities are fully maximised. And this builds on some of the points that Mary and other speakers have made. Strengthening social infrastructure is highlighted as a significant feature in this new package, and in order to do this, cities need to move on from the so-called triple helix partnership with business and academia to furthering the quadruple helix initiatives that embed the voice of people and communities through third sector organisations in the growth agenda. For example, in December 2013, he launched a social enterprise quarter in the Digbeth area of Birmingham, where over 50 social enterprises are based. And Birmingham City Council has pledged to support the development of a thriving social enterprise sector, seeing it as an important part of a healthy, mixed local economy. He would have told you about other investment opportunities they have identified and pursuing. And these are all investment opportunities in a city whose transport infrastructure has been woefully underinvested in over the past 25 years, and whose unemployment rate is nearly twice the national rate of 5.8%. And that is the second highest of all the UK's major cities. And this is a city in which 67% of their total income comes from central UK government, and which will be slashed significantly year on year. There is a clear message here about the level of local discretion with regards to local reserves. The UK economy, as you will know, is one of the most centralist in Europe. The imperative for investment at the local level in our major cities, such as Birmingham, is clear. So how much will such a plan for long-term investment funds link and add value to local growth strategies and investment? I think that's a key question that we all need to consider. To conclude, he'd want to finish with a simple message. Please do not forget the role that the local level can play in the delivery of a European long-term investment fund of funds for innovative social infrastructure. Something that needs to be overcome in this is the lack of tools, and by that he means powers and funding, which currently act as a straitjacket preventing cities taking leadership for the very measures that this new EU investment package aims to adopt. Finally, he would say that the radical devolution of powers and finances, or in the case of a European long-term investment fund, the access to finance, must be part of the response to ensure sustainable economic growth in Europe. Thank you. I think we now have time to make the exchange with Steve's panel, so you can just set up and be ready to go ahead, okay?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say I'm quite amazed at the numbers we have here today. Yesterday was possibly suppressed by the strike, but I thought today being Saturday, so to reiterate the message, you've done a grand job coming here. This is a continuation of the session organised and run by Integrate, a new think tank, and specifically on social infrastructure. And we're going to, I think, employ quite a wide definition of what social infrastructure means. It won't just be the response of the charitable sector, for example, or those linked to it. It could also include mainline social sectors. Just a little bit on my credentials for talking here. I'm actually another EIB person, though in my case an ex-EIB person. I left the bank a couple of years ago after a long career there, and there were a number, of course, of my colleagues and ex-colleagues who are present here. Several people yesterday talked about the lack of projects, the demand side, as being the real problem and supply side not. And that, I think, most powerfully came over from Thierry Deo. I'm not sure it's completely true. And if it is true, we don't have a place here, so we'd be leaving now. But let's work on the assumption that supply side is not quite so sorted, and we therefore do need to develop that area. At the minimum, there's an interface between supply and demand, and that we need to recognise. As a professional economist, I'm rather used to looking at supply, looking at demand, and then working out how they interact. So I'm quite comfortable with our remit. We do actually, of course, have other sessions, not just the one on demand, which we've come from, but also a session looking at the players involved, and one that's more or less centred around the concept of LTIFs. So there will be opportunity to bite at this particular sandwich from a number of different directions. I have 4 experts on the panel with me here, and I have to say they are all more expert than I am. We will be changing the order just a little bit because it seemed to be more convenient to do so. The first person up is Georg Indast, who's a consultant who's been working in this area for a very long time and has profound knowledge of the role of long-term investing institutions. After that, it will be Olaf Jones from Insurance Europe. Subsequently, Matti Lepälä from Pensions Europe. So we have representatives from the 2 really big long-term investment institution representatives. And then finishing off with Carol Biot from the OECD, who brings knowledge of a major research study. But without any more, I'll pass over to Georg with one final comment that we are hoping to move relatively rapidly, and if we get a chance for some questions and interface with the floor, that would be ideal, but we'll see how we go. Thank you. Georg.
Thank you, Stephen. Social infrastructure. It is sort of, I was thinking before coming to this conference, somehow surprisingly, it has received relatively little attention in the whole discussion about infrastructure, private finance, and institutional investment in infrastructure. And I also have been looking around the literature, including my own literature. I've been writing over the last 10 years or so, and just sort of scanning through the word social and so on and so on. And it typically comes as an end after transport, energy, and social. So I would include myself. And actually, there has been very little specific literature about social infrastructure investment, although, and that has to be said, in terms of the overall importance, it is not that unimportant, not only for the reason we heard from the demand side panel, but also looking at the overall finance figures. For example, for Europe, and here looking at the EIB statistics they produced in a report, so 1% of GDP in Europe, roughly 1%, goes into social infrastructure, in this case defined in a hard way, defined as a physical investment, so the gross fixed capital investment in health and education. And this is somewhere between a fourth and a third of the total infrastructure investment, so one wonders actually the importance is there. And in terms of the sort of financing side of it, we find quite big differences within social infrastructure. For example, education is very much publicly financed, about 80% in Europe, and this is against an average of all infrastructure finance of about 1/3 public financed. Health is a bit more mixed, it's sort of more private investment in there than in education. When we look at the sort of private finance, project finance and PPP, public-private partnerships, there social infrastructure is a relatively small sort of, well, let me put it that way. PPP is a relatively small component of social infrastructure investments, only about 6 to 7% in Europe. So that just to say that the majority of finance comes from the public or from the corporate side. And that sort of PPP investment is very much concentrated in a few countries, well, in particular in the UK. And sort of moving on to so looking at different vehicles in infrastructure investment, for example, within the infrastructure fund universe, as we find in the Preqin database, it's quite interesting to see that about between 10 or 20%, but let's say somewhere around 15% is social infrastructure in terms of the deals made. So again, it's a significant figure there. But the striking figure there is that 80% of those deals in social infrastructure happen in Europe, and of which a majority in UK. And you can already see that the UK PFI program being sort of one leader since the early 1990s. Looking at the listed infrastructure universe, things are different. There are hardly any pure social infrastructure stocks on the stock market, although there are investment trusts listed in the UK and in Australia which do focus at least partly on social infrastructure, and also in New Zealand, for example. And of course, to complete the sort of that walk through the different vehicles, we also find the old style PFI bonds in UK and the sort of newer style project bonds that are coming out these days. Now, what is so well? A simple question, and we in this very complex discussions, we need to simplify sometimes a little bit. What is really different with social infrastructure? From an investor perspective, and what you typically hear and notice, and I'm glad David and Mary already pointed to some of those issues, so I don't have to dwell on too long. Social infrastructure projects tend to be smaller than the rest of the infrastructure universe, which is a problem, and it was mentioned already. It could be a problem for large pension funds, so they just it takes a lot of resources to do a lot of sort of small deals. They're typically based on concessions, contracts, and availability payments, as opposed to sort of user payment, which is prevalent, for example, in the energy sector. Thirdly, they're being perceived as being low risk and return, and which is probably right in the sense that there's relatively low demand risk in this universe, and they're often inflation linked. But what comes with that dominance of the availability payments in social infrastructure is the importance of the political side of it. So there is the political and regulatory risk is of course very prevalent in this sector, which has its consequences and its implications for investment strategies. So basically, to cut it all very short, investors always are going to go to invest in this area if they have a lot of trust and confidence in whoever is on the public side, and that's the government. So, thirdly, very briefly, we do have quite pronounced definitional issues here. And when we're looking at the statistical side, and when we look at the actual investment that's happening, people tend to use a hard definition of social infrastructure. That's really sort of brick and mortar, the physical side of hospital buildings, school buildings, kindergartens, and so on. And of course, we already from the discussion we had today, and that will probably continue, social can mean a lot of other things. So we can have a lot of softer connotations. Into what is good for society and culture and education, and it's sort of which is a definition of social which you find in ESG, environmental, socially government-driven or socially responsible investment-driven investment strategies. So now, how these things? Well, there's of course a relationship there, but it's not an easy relationship. And furthermore, looking as an economist, you also look at national account statistics and so on. There again, there isn't really much of a definition of infrastructure in those areas anyway, but certainly not for social infrastructure. So we do have definitional issues there. We do have data issues there, because the different type of data, that's a typical infrastructure issue anyway, but it's even more pronounced on the social infrastructure side, which need to be worked on very hard. And they're also sort of, I think, deep conceptual issues, and I think we're making sort of small progress here today to at least to trash it out. As a last idea, and that sort of came to me only yesterday while I was sitting here and listening to the various interesting talks and discussions, and there's a lot of focus on institutional investor here, and I'm just wondering whether, particularly on the social infrastructure side, whether it would often not be more akin to private investor. We have huge wealth out there, which is with private people, family offices, wealth funds, also retail money. Boston Consulting Group produced this figure of $135 billion, which is higher than Rafaela's $92 trillion of institutional money. So, sure, of course, not all of this can go into infrastructure and would not be suitable, and so on and so on and so on. But that is growing fast, and it's also growing fast in emerging markets. And it is easier for individuals and for private money to build in social goals or even ethical goals into investment strategies. People do a lot of charity work, people do buy art, people do a lot of collecting, people give to universities, and if people give to universities, and that's being used for building there, why shall people not give more money for kindergartens or even hospitals where they or their parents were treated? So I think I'm just wondering the whole sort of private capital side has not been, I think, has not been mentioned even once in the last 1.5 days. And I think that's probably, and it's going to be easier because institutional investment is always going to be bound by regulation. We will hear from the two speakers after me for sure, and will be bound by very, very strong risk-return measurement, control, management and so on consideration. It's all getting very, very complicated. So I want to leave and stop there.
Thank you, Gail. I'm not going to try and summarize that, but I think we should move straight on. Next talk is from Olaf Jones from Insurance Europe.
The challenges from the supply side in terms of financing projects, including social projects. But many of the issues that we face with financing social projects will be common for financing infrastructure and general investments. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of that. Just very quickly, I'm from Insurance Europe, and we represent the insurance industry across Europe, and that covers insurers, reinsurers, mutuals, etc. And the insurance market in Europe is actually the largest in the world, and we have significant interest in this topic because we are, because of our business model, major investors. And I think the important thing to obviously remember is that our business model is different from banks in the sense we get premiums up front from our customers, and we have to invest those over a period of time. And often that period of time can be many, many years, can be up to even 70, 80 years in some markets because of the products. And this allows us to be long-term investors. But in doing so, we can also create, as well as the benefits for our policyholders, as a side effect, we can create significant benefits for economic growth and financial stability, because we can be, in line with the OECD research, we can be long-term, stable, patient investors as well. Now this, because of the amount of premiums we get and the amount of time we get to accumulate them, this makes us very large investors. In fact, we have currently over 8.5 trillion of assets under investment, and this then really obviously makes us particularly interested in the discussions that are going on now. And therefore, we very much welcome the focus on long-term investment. We know that many have been looking at this for a while and trying to generate interest in this topic. We ourselves have been certainly focusing on this very much over the last few years, and we very much welcome the Commission's focus on this topic because we think that there are a variety of things that need to be addressed, and it's not a simple thing in order to get more of the available money that is out there, and we definitely have a lot, the pension industry has a lot, but the question is what is stopping it getting into the right source places? And I think we're also very proud as insurers of the role we play, not just in providing returns to our customers, but how we can play a role with society. And we know that our customers like the idea of how their money is spent and where it can be spent on things which they can see in their community and across Europe. So from that point of view, we have a double benefit. We also understand that while we're interested in all types of assets, we also understand why right now there is a particular interest in the type of assets that can have the most immediate effect on growth and employment in Europe. So that doesn't mean the other types of asset investments, corporate investments, general investments in the stock market are less important to us, but we do understand why there's focus on infrastructure, securitization and SME investment, given the need in Europe to rekindle growth and employment. Now, when we look at this problem, for us, we see three things that policymakers should really take into account. And I think, in fact, Gabriel mentioned yesterday, Bernardino from EIOPA, one which is often not mentioned enough, and I think we would definitely think the policymakers should not forget this in the larger scheme of things, and that is they need to keep the flow of premiums from investors, that's policyholders, pensioners, companies, saving either directly or on behalf of their employees for the future. They need to be willing to give up the liquidity to allow us to invest long term. If that flow stops, then we will no longer have premiums to invest, and we will no longer be able to take a long-term patient view. Then we have the issue, which I'll come into more detail, of why the supply of projects and the type of projects may not be suitable to allow us to invest, and then I'll touch on some of the regulatory disincentives that need to be removed. But coming on to the barriers, now we heard some of these yesterday, and so I'll really focus maybe on the one which I think is maybe least talked about or certainly maybe most difficult to solve, because some of the issues where we've identified a lack of supply of suitable investments. We really hope that the pipeline project, where we now have 2,000 projects in a pipeline, could help solve that. So there are things happening to help address that issue. We've also a concern about the lack of standardization of documentation, contracts, etc. Again, we see the Juncker initiative, the investment plan, having elements around standardization and ensuring high quality documentation, allowing our companies to do the appropriate risk assessment. So these things we hope will be addressed. We also think they need to look at deal size. Now, it's been mentioned that in some cases companies need large deal sizes, and it's true you have some companies who want to invest 50 million, 100, even several hundred million in one go, and will take significant parts of both the greenfield early investment stage, equity stage, as well as the later operational stage. However, there are also companies who want smaller deal sizes. I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday from an insurance company who said what he would like is 250,000 to 500,000 chunks. So he needs an easy way to syndicate, to take a syndicated part of a total exposure. It's important that the projects are divided clearly into this greenfield and brownfield stages. There are some companies interested in greenfield, and they would like access to that at a lower cost, at more efficient access. But the vast majority of the industry will tend to be interested in the brownfield or bond type investments. And again, this is where we think the investment fund from the investment plan, Juncker's plan, could help, because there are ways you can take greenfield or risky investments and use the guarantee money within the fund to turn that investment into chunks of bond-type investments that may appeal to a wider group of insurers. The details of how that's going to happen is going to be very interesting to see how we can achieve that, especially as has been discussed, there isn't any actual new money in there. It is intended to do through more sort of financial engineering. So we'll have to see how that works. But the one area I would like to mention here is the concern about political risk. And this is really one which is very important. If a company is going to invest for 20 years into a project, they need to be certain that the deal is not going to be changed, that the contractual agreements and the environment, tax and otherwise around that deal are going to be honored by the government or the counterparty. And we have had, unfortunately, very recently, some bad experience in the industry where some very large deals have been changed after the investment has happened, and that has really jeopardized the entire investment. And that has frankly given insurers some cold feet about going into this wholeheartedly. This, however, will be a challenge to solve, but again, if there's a determination to do it, we think and we hope that can be addressed as well. In terms of the regulatory disincentives, I think here one thing I will mention in particular is the concerns about Solvency II, but there are some other ones. The accounting rules, making sure that when you invest long term, you don't create artificial volatility through the accounting measures, that they allow us to represent the business model as it is. That's still a challenge for us. Even EMIR, the derivatives regulation, can cause us some problems because it forces us to hold a lot more cash, and that reduces the amount we can invest in real assets. And we think that some further attention would have been needed there. But let me just focus to finish on Solvency II and what the essence of our concern is there. And here, I should very strongly say that we very strongly support a risk-based approach, and we have absolutely been supporting that all the way through the development of Solvency II. But the key question is, what are the real risks that we're facing? And this is where we would have, we think, some discussion around the calibrations for Solvency II are needed. There's been a lot of criticism, for example, around how some of the calibrations have come down for securitization, and I just wanted to point out that the original calibrations, for example, were 80% for a AA 5-year high-quality securitization. That's been brought down to 15%, which is great, because 80% would have killed the market for us completely, but the actual accumulative entire defaults of that type of asset over the entire crisis period was only 14 basis points. So in terms of conservativeness, we still think there are some questions. Likewise, for infrastructure, the AA 25-year bond of infrastructure bond would cost us 16%. The actual default rates of AA corporate bonds during the crisis was only 1 year, and that only 1 year was above 0%, and that was at 0.38%. And we do believe infrastructure is even lower risk than normal corporate debt. So we do think this deserves some further thought and discussion in order to make sure we're not creating unnecessary disincentives, because we do feel that capital charges could be lowered without jeopardizing policyholder security. Thank you very much.
So now moving on to Matti, who is not going to give a presentation, we'll just talk from here. Yeah?
Yes. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think the two previous speakers mentioned many of the important issues that I want to raise as well, but also some of the details. It was a good definition of social infrastructure investments in a study done by EdHec Risk Institute in 2012, which reads that investing in social infrastructure means investing directly or indirectly in debt or equity backed by long-term public-private contracts for the provision of specific capital goods and their related usage, in which different parties agree to take different risks and to receive their related payoffs. And that really puts the whole, I think, the essential issues in picture. So what we are aiming as pension funds is to develop a long-term investment environment and instruments such as public-private partnerships to facilitate investments in social infrastructure. Social infrastructure is, of course, important. It's hospitals, schools, prisons, elderly housing, things that pension fund participants, members, beneficiaries, and the society, of course, use on a daily basis. It's not a separate asset class in itself. And, of course, there are differences in social infrastructure to many other types of infrastructure like roads or bridges or railways. Of course, pension funds as major investments in government bonds finance a lot of the social infrastructure. But the problem with the crisis is that there's a tendency and need to shift a lot of this debt off balance. And that's another debate in relation to, for example, the UK private finance initiative that has been successful in facilitating social infrastructure investments, a debate whether this debt actually should be on balance as a public debt and not off balance. And of course, pension funds really care about the society and the future of the society. They are very big investors in responsible investments. In some countries like the Netherlands, UK, Scandinavian countries, it's very much the theme for all the investments, regardless of the assets that are used. But then, of course, the most important thing for pension funds is the role of pension funds, and it's both social and financial. The financial side is that the primary goal of pension funds is to provide for retirement income. And the members and beneficiaries would hardly accept good intentions to provide for the greater good if they are left without retirement income. So that is the first responsibility. Of course, has a huge social impact as well. If retirement income is not provided, it will have major consequences. But then, of course, the social, because pension funds are social institutions and investors in long-term liabilities, and therefore they are large investors into the real economy. But fundamental issue for us is that pension funds should not be forced into making these investments. And that is one of the issues. Pension funds cannot save the world by themselves. They cannot substitute for the society. But they, of course, cannot step outside the society. They are very much in the society. What do we need then? We need to have a stable long-term investment environment. Governments have to be stable partners and social infrastructure investment is inherently linked to government policy. And what it means that the government should not expropriate the returns that the pension funds expect based on the contracts that they make with governments. And so that the investment should return what has been promised. And that is a major issue. These are very long-term investments, and it is more than likely that the governments during the duration of the investment, 20, 30 years, even longer, are often willing and able to change the rules and renegotiate the terms of these investments. That is a very difficult issue to deal with. But as Olof mentioned, there are many barriers to these investment, regulation, fiscal accounting, other rules, and we need to tackle those. Supervisory frameworks should better understand pension fund investments into these very illiquid investments. The risk-based supervision is very short-term in its view and doesn't really pay adequate attention to the long-term returns, and that is an issue, I'm sure, for both pension funds and insurers. All in all, there's not enough understanding in the regulatory and supervisory framework for the long-term investments and long-term assets, meaning liquidity issues, taxation issues, transaction costs. But the instrument to do this investment is public-private partnership, and that has been also successful. There are some good examples from the Dutch pension funds. One of the second biggest pension fund for the care and welfare sector has made through its service provider PGGM investments in the UK student housing, and is a major stakeholder in what's called UPP, which holds more than 20,000 student housing units in the UK. And it has been a good investment, providing long-term inflation-linked income. And in the Netherlands, then, the Parliament has asked, why are the Dutch pension funds investing in student housing in the UK and not in the Netherlands, where there is also a need for this? And then the Dutch funds have explained why it works in the UK, and it is really because of this framework. Model of cooperation between the investor, UPP, and the university. The size of the investments, they need to be big enough. And then the market and the regulation, that in the UK market it is highly privatized, and in the Netherlands it's not. So pension funds are not able to invest in the Netherlands in the same way as they are in the UK. Diversification is a challenge for pension funds. If pension funds invest in equity, you can have a good diversification with a quite small number of different equity investments. With infrastructure and social infrastructure investments, it is much more difficult to have effective diversification, which means that you are taking very big risks with your investments. And as I said, in the end, the members and beneficiaries are actually interested in the real returns and that they get their pensions. And if you take big risks, they may and will materialize, of course. So we need stability, we need predictability, we need a framework that supports these investments. Most of Europe is very underdeveloped in this regard. These UK experiences have been quite good. Of course, the debate is ongoing. Some other countries, like Spain or Finland, have done some, not without problems. There's great potential for this. For example, this pension fund that I mentioned for the health and care and welfare sector has announced that they will quadruple their sustainable investments, and social infrastructure investments are part of this. They will quadruple them, but still after that there will be 16 billion. And all in all, the social infrastructure investments are very small in Europe. According to this EdHec paper, they were around 100 billion all in Europe, which is of course a very small amount in relation to the need for these investments. So the current paradigm is about return and risks, and that will remain very important also in the future, but there's very much focus on financial terms, and we don't value enough in any part of this framework the social impact of pension fund investments, and that's what we need to rethink and refocus. How can we take better into consideration the long-term investments and their social impact? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matti. Now the last speaker, and of course not the least, is Carol Bio from OECD.
So, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to continue on the really stimulating discussions that we also had yesterday, and to take into account all the challenges and concerns that have been raised. So I'd like to address this supply side question from a slightly different angle, because we've been talking about the financial regulations and really the financing side, and of course, as has been raised on several occasions yesterday, for instance, by Meridium and others, finance isn't really the central problem. There's also a need to focus on projects and the delivery, and more broadly on the framework for investment in the countries that receive that investment. So there's a need to focus on market imperfections as well as government commitment. And government commitment has been particularly raised in terms of political risk, stability, and predictability. So I'm going to quickly go through and talk about how countries and infrastructure markets that want to attract, whether it's foreign or domestic investment and long-term investment into infrastructure and social infrastructure, can make the business case stronger and can make their infrastructure more attractive for private investment. So first of all, well, I'm going to approach this through three different angles. I'm going to look first of all at the returns on investment, secondly on appropriability of returns, and that's linked to the political risk, and then I'm going to look at market access as well. And this is all the questions that we address at the OECD. I'm speaking on behalf of the investment division. So looking at the rate of return, there is the question of predictability, and specifically of predictability of pricing, especially in strategic infrastructure sectors where tariff setting can be subject to different political and other considerations. And so it's important for investors, obviously, to know how they can recover their costs in the long term. And so we look at the independence of infrastructure regulators and the extent to which they may be subject to control by state-owned enterprises or line ministries. So that's something that is important for policymakers to look at if they want to attract investment. And evidence from 13 OECD countries suggests that on average a one-step change in either incentive pricing or independence of regulators in infrastructure can induce a 5.3% increase in the ratio of investment to gross value added in any given infrastructure sector. So there's really a case for policymakers to make a move on that. Beyond issues of red tape, etc., that were brought up yesterday, there's just more structural issues to consider. Then moving on to appropriability of returns, we're talking about government commitment and the risk that the government reneges on a given infrastructure contract, and beyond that across political cycles. How do we know that there will still be space for private investors in a given sector over time and when administrations change? And so, of course, there's the idea of having the long-term infrastructure investment plans, and that's very useful, and it includes the pipelines, etc. But beyond that, there's also basic protection of investor rights that we look at in terms of access to dispute settlement and dispute resolution, and freedom from expropriation. And so we look a lot at the investor disputes and infrastructure disputes that are brought to ICSID and to international dispute settlement cases, and this is particularly important in the current context. It's been debated in terms of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, that's been subject to a lot of debate right now, because it seeks to integrate infrastructure markets in the EU and the US, but several countries, notably Germany, have opposed it on the basis of the investor-state dispute clause that allows disputes to be brought to the international level, and they feel that that's a breach of sovereignty, except that it's really critical in order to give investors, especially in the long term, some real, some sort of procedural teeth that they can bring in case of need. So that's something that we'll need to think about more. Then more specifically in terms of rate of return and appropriability, a quick look at PPP and procurement legislation. We look at this a lot, and so it was addressed yesterday in the PPP session, value for money, knowing when to choose the private route instead of other forms of procurement. So I won't go into detail, but apart from the fact that we also look at the role of performance contracting, the role of inclusion of societies and civil society in the delivery of infrastructure contracts, and also renegotiation. And renegotiation is a key part of all infrastructure contracts and should also be part of concession and PPP legislation, especially when underlying economic conditions change. So that's something that's recently the new EU directive on concessions has introduced a modification distinguishing between substantial modification in economic conditions and less substantial ones, where either the contract needs to be renegotiated or you need to go back to tender. And that's something that is very realistic and very helpful for both the private sector and the public sector. So that sort of model is very encouraging. So I'll go on now onto the market access conditions, because that's really the precondition before even looking at the incentives. Is there even space for private participation? And so in terms of market access, it's not actually very straightforward. We look at the OECD's FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index, shows that across OECD countries, including in Europe, a lot of sectors, including energy, transport, but also some more social infrastructure sectors, have restrictions on foreign ownership of these sectors, and that the trend isn't necessarily improving. So that's one constraint. And then if we look at public procurement, public procurement that isn't sufficiently competitive can also obviously hinder investment. There can be domestic preference margins, or there can be local content requirements that have been rising, in particular in the renewable energy sector recently. And that can, of course, might not reach the job creation impacts that it's looking for, while blocking out some investors that can bring some important technology transfer. And there's an important link between that and regional projects. We're talking about energy, cross-border projects, as well as rail. Local content requirements can fragment potentially viable regional projects. So that's something that's to be considered in the EU framework. Finally, market structure is also, the role of state-owned enterprises in infrastructure markets is very important. They're actually growing, their role is actually growing, and it's something that has to be addressed as a complement to private investment, and not just as a competitive force, because SOEs aren't really going to go away. And so that's why, beyond structural separation of infrastructure networks, it's important to look at the corporate governance and the efficiency of these state-owned enterprises, and how they can best cooperate with private investors. So briefly to conclude, how does the OECD work on these questions? Well, we bring all of these diverse policy fields together within the policy framework for investment. There's some copies downstairs which address lots of different facets of investment, with a specific chapter on infrastructure, and it's been applied in over 30 countries since 2006. And we also have applied it at sector level, so we have a guidance for clean energy infrastructure, as well as for private participation in infrastructure. And it's in addition been taken to the regional level. So with the Southern African Development Community and with ASEAN, we're working with them to build on these tools to develop regional policy frameworks for infrastructure investment to align policies and facilitate cross-border projects. So those are some examples. We also have data, and we try to help countries build maybe platforms for public-private dialogue on these issues. And the OECD is looking forward to work with EU policymakers as well as investors such as yourselves to better understand the policy obstacles and the structural obstacles in Europe and to lift them together. So the good news is that not only are there financial incentives for investors, but there's also political incentives for the politicians to address some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carol, for that. There's clearly an immense amount of work behind there that you can go explore on the OECD website or via those reports. My ambition to have time to get some questions from the floor has just been thwarted, but I think you got value for money out of them, so I'm not going to complain too much. It seemed to me there were a few themes which emerged during that, and I'm sure those themes are going to recur as well in the other sessions today. One is about definitions, and that came up particularly from both Georg and Matti. The small size of the social infrastructure market compared to its importance to society measured in a variety of different ways. That was something, again, that Georg raised, and I think it's something that should give us pause. It means that there's a lot more to be done. Obviously, the point about the stability of the environment and how markets are not going to grow unless that's assured, including things like the independence of the regulator. That came through from Olaf, Matti, and from Carl. Surprisingly, at least I found it surprisingly, some of the supply-side market participants are interested in small projects. They actually find them desirable, which is almost the opposite of what we often hear. On the other hand, standardized in terms as much as possible, because if not, it's difficult to appraise them. And that nevertheless, diversification can be difficult. So there's a series of thoughts emerging there from Olaf and from Matti. And then finally, the Carol's interventions, which were about conditions around appropriability and social rate of return and market structure. I think we need to probably reflect on that. I'd just like to give thanks to all of our speakers in a normal way, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.